Welcome to the webinar, The Role of Science and Science Funders in the Time of the COVID-19 Crisis, which is being hosted by the International Science Council. Thank you very much for being with us today. My name is Katya Pavlovets. I'm Senior Science Officer at the International Science Council. Before we start, a few housekeeping points. Our webinar will be of total of 1.5 hours. It will be recorded and made available tomorrow. All participants, except for the speakers, are automatically muted. If you are willing to pose the questions, please put your question in the question box. Please provide your name, organization, and who your question is for. Once all presentations is made, the moderator will read out the questions to the panelists. With that, let me hand over to Heide Hackman, CEO of the International Science Council, who will be moderating the session. Heide, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Katya, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone online. Let me also invite our speakers today to turn on their cameras. As Katya has said, colleagues, my name is Heide Hackman. I'm the CEO of the ISC, and it is a great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Council to our webinar on the role of science and science funders in the time of COVID-19. Colleagues, we've all, I'm sure, spent much of our time during the past 3 or 4 months in lockdown or partial lockdown, thinking about and indeed responding to some of the very deep challenges and indeed new opportunities for science during this time of global crisis. COVID-19 has placed science in the policy and public eye in ways that are unprecedented in our lifetimes. So what do we make of our response to date? And what lessons are we learning about the impacts of the pandemic in the immediate and longer term, both positive and negative, on science and science practices and systems around the world? What do we anticipate as being the emerging priorities and action agendas for science as we rally towards recovery thinking? As we imagine the new normal for scientists and for their institutions that support them, for science policy, and most importantly, for the role of science in supporting our societies to build back better, to use the terminology of the UN Secretary General. These are big questions, and today we want to address them through the lenses, the experiences and perspectives of the science funding community. We do this in the context of the ISC's ongoing work with what is called the Global Forum of Funders, which refers to a growing group of national research councils, international donor aid agencies and foundations that first came together in 2019 and that seeks to catalyze strategic collaboration and collective action aimed at accelerating the impact of science and of science funding on the achievement of the SDGs. Clearly, the central ideas that underlie the ambitions of the Global Forum of Funders, ideas about the importance of promoting international scientific collaboration on urgent transformations to sustainability challenges, must be part of our thinking about the imperatives for science in a post-COVID world, and I'm sure that we will come back to this in our discussions today. Many of the organizations that are part of the Global Forum of Funders initiative are represented online today, and key actors from that community are included in our outstanding lineup of speakers. Let me introduce them to you very briefly. They include Dr. Dominique Charon, who is Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at the International Development Research Center in Canada, Dr. Molapo Krubela, who is CEO of the National Research Foundation of South Africa, Dr. Nikita Vorjani, who is responsible for European and international collaboration at the French National Research Agency, and Dr. Kostas Glinos, who unfortunately is not able to turn on his camera today. He has joined us by phone, I believe, but Dr. Glinos is head of the unit for open science in DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. In addition, and to initiate our conversation today, we are very grateful to have with us Sir Peter Gluckman, President-elect of the International Science Council and Chair of the International Network for Government Science Advice, INSA. A very warm welcome to all our speakers, and thank you very much for making time to join us today. Colleagues, in terms of the order for proceeding, following the interventions by our speakers, we will have time, as Katja has indicated, to take a few questions from our online audience. And for this purpose, just as a reminder, please use the question rather than the chat function, where Katja will be receiving your questions, clustering them to help us ensure that we get to address at least a few of them. Let me just say that all your questions will be gathered, and we will also take those into consideration about the possibility of having another webinar to follow up on this one on some of the critical issues that arise out of today's discussion. So a reminder to the speakers, I am now about to hand over to our keynote, to Peter. And when I do that, if I could ask you all to mute yourselves and switch off cameras. And Peter, should you go over time, I will switch on my camera and you will see me smiling at you. So I'd like to, with that, hand over to you, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of those on the webinar. The ongoing challenges to sustainability and resilience are obvious, but in the last year we've seen the range of challenges grow. COVID has highlighted our own fragility in a world where population densities have increased, where populations have aged, and where travel has created environments that are global rather than local. It has highlighted how cooperation extending between foundations, governments, universities, and the private sector can work together. It has highlighted the importance of open science, but it's also shown where nationalism can interfere with progress. It has also brought science directly into the area of geostrategic and societal tensions. Risks to social cohesion have been exacerbated by understandable fear and also by misinformation. Trust in government has in some cases been strengthened, but in other cases weakened. And COVID is not the only stressor of note. Climate change and environmental degradation remain areas where domestic interests still outweigh global action. And issues of equity and equality have tragically again been brought to the fore as years of overt and covert discrimination are exposed. Sustainability is not just about the environment. It's also about culture, people, and their individual and social lives, the institutions of society and the economy, and their resilience and adaptability. COVID shows how intimately all these are linked. It's put science and scientists on the front page of every paper and at the top of news broadcasts. Generally, science has been seen as trusted and valued, but already there are those who are arguing that science has created or exaggerated the crisis and is responsible for the recession. Science denial and misinformation are rife. As we reflect on the pandemic, what can we learn about the conduct of and the future of the science system? And COVID's done something else. It's changed the speed at which we need to think and act. And given that I only have a very few minutes, I'm going to pose some rather difficult questions and make some sweeping generalizations to push our thinking about the science system forward. In many countries, COVID and its socioeconomic consequences have created an appetite for a reset across many policies. COVID may not have fundamentally changed things, but it's brought to attention many trends that were apparent before COVID, but were not being adequately addressed. In the past, other major recessions and crises have similarly created inflection points, and there's a sense that the post-COVID normality will not be simply a return to business as usual. The current science system emerged over the last 70 years. The Second World War and then the Cold War largely shaped many aspects of it, a shape largely determined by a few dominant rich countries. Then the economic model of neoliberalism became reflected into science, with an increasingly competitive system competing for funds and outcomes measured by academic metrics, including bibliometrics and research incomes. Surely this is the scientific equivalent of stock prices. neither really reflecting either the value of the company in the case of stock prices or of the research in the case of academic metrics. And the system has become increasingly industrialized with the expansion of tertiary education. The major reason for many research grants became matters of employment, promotion, and tenure for the scientist rather than addressing societal need. With the new millennium came the MDGs and then the SDGs. So too came Michael Giddens' very important paper in the last issue of Nature of the Old Millennium, discussing the social contract between science and society. The increasing recognition that the beneficiaries of new knowledge needed to be the community as well as the scientific society. In that context, it's no accident that when in 2018, the ISC was informed that its mission is encapsulated in the phrase, science as a global public good. I want to focus on 2 or 3 areas. First, the problem of siloed science. We're but a decade from 2030. The SDGs remain aspirational and certainly a long way from any sense of achievement. Progress on them is highlighted in the 2019 Global Sustainability Development Report has been disappointing. And while scientists can claim virtually anything they do might relate to the SDGs, that is very different to actually achieving real progress towards achieving them. And indeed, of the 17 goals, the focus has tended to be only on a small subset. Much of the problem lies in our siloed approaches. Most funders treat the SDGs as isolated goals, independent from each other, and within them choose to fit what meets their own agenda. Yet all the SDGs are intimately linked. The work of ISC's predecessor, ICSU, and now ISC, INSA, and the European Commission working together with others shows the many connections between them. Indeed, if one looks at the SDGs and the scientific effort that goes into them, one can see 2 groups, a group that is heavily invested in and a group that gets little attention. Yet system thinking shows the limits of that approach. Indeed, both the work of the World in 2050 and of the 2019 Global Development Sustainability Report highlight the essentiality of these interlinked goals and suggest that we need to focus on the transformations that link them. The data in some natural sciences have been well funded in the name of sustainability, but social science, the normative disciplines, and transdisciplinarity have not. Yet to make real progress, it's that transdisciplinary approach that is surely needed. This has a very distinct meaning in terms of how questions are framed and stakeholders are engaged. The OECD report on transdisciplinarity, released just a few days ago, on the urgent need for all aspects of the science system, from funders to providers, to transform the way they operate to get beyond disciplinary silos to support genuine post-transdisciplinary approaches is critical. The concept of post-normal science encapsulates these very similar concepts. Let me quote from Diane Coyle, the renowned economist, from her piece in Nature just 2 weeks ago. Sadly, academic incentives work against people who are brave enough to cross into another disciplinary territory. Career funding and publishing structures reward research into small, narrow questions, while the world has big, complex problems. University, research institutes, and laboratories are condemning themselves to irrelevance in the future, and worse, if they do not break the shackles of departments and disciplines and reward academics for policy relevance as well as for basic research. This requires institutional reform, and that includes the funders. High-profile funders, as well as those in the public sector, could make a powerful point by insisting that programs integrate disciplines. COVID highlights all of this. It's not simply a matter for virologists and epidemiologists. It's been a matter that needs a broad range of scholars, from economics to behavioral science, from mathematics to communication studies. Only with the appropriate framing of problems, a framing that looks through multiple lenses at once, including those of stakeholders, can the knowledge gained have real impact on the real problems that impact our planet, our society, our environment, and our economy. Yet when I look around the world of funding, what I see is a traditional, disciplinary, and largely predetermined funding basis. It is in all our interests that the science system does not get stuck in a late 20th century model, but evolves to suit a world which is much more interconnected, moving at pace, and throwing up multiple existential threats, from a loss of social cohesion in many societies to that of climate change. In essence, what I'm suggesting is for funding organisations to look at their underlying strategies. Whose needs is the current strategy meeting? That of the funder, the society, and its future, or that of the scientist? Human development and resilience are closely related to broad concepts of sustainability. The UNDP has started an important project jointly with the IDRC to look at including a broad range of disciplinary inputs to move human development from a narrow to a much more holistic understanding of human potential and well-being. I applaud the willingness of the UNDP to set a common agenda. Now let me turn to the related issues of redundant science and a lack of coordination. All said and done, resources are always limited. The issues of reproducibility have been well documented. It itself is a consequence in no small part of the ways the funding system operates and the incentives operating in the science system. But do we really need 3 million papers a year, many of which are never read? Individual and institutional incentives set by governments, funders, agencies, and universities drive this inefficient and increasingly misdirected culture, which is reinforced by the inherent drive of most scientists to build their symbolic capital. On the other hand, verification and replication are core to scientific progress and validation. How do we achieve the balance? Fewer papers and a greater focus on experimental design. Easy comments to make, especially for the large advanced economies, but there are equity and capacity building issues that are of increasingly acute importance, especially in the global south. Similar inefficiencies exist in the conduct of international science. Duplicative activities are often driven by institutional egos. There are replicative conferences, even now while travel is limited. The number of duplicative conferences is extraordinary, and the issues of duplication effort, where collaboration is needed, is increasingly obvious. Funder mandates may be limited to an area of science or to a geography, but when the research is substantially duplicative beyond reasons of verification, funders need clarity of their objective. Is the context different enough to justify replication? Is it primarily a function of career development and so forth? Too often, the claims made for the need to do that research merit serious interrogation. And when we come to the global challenges, the major funders have particular obligations to society. A more coordinated approach is urgently needed if the existential risks of climate change, sea level rise, fractured social cohesion, etc. are to be addressed. Technological change also creates a raft of challenges. While much focuses on both the positive impact of a digital world for sustainability, social sciences will also point to a raft of potential downsides. It behoves us to be looking at both sides of the coin. The science needed for the sustainability agenda, whether we're dealing with the acute issues of COVID or chronic existential threats like climate change, is complex, inter and transdisciplinary, and cannot be easily separated from the issues of understanding policy priorities, policy agendas, and public engagement. In the early 19th century, scientists were largely self-funded amateurs. In the early 21st century, scientists are largely responding to the money sources available to them. This means that funders have enormous power to influence the direction of science. What tools do they have? co-funding, coordinated funding, ensuring a balance of efforts using all the knowledge disciplines, finding ways to support transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. These are all easy things to say and make a lot of sense, but the reality is that with few exceptions, this does not occur. We still see the bulk of research organized in disciplinary silos, biased in its profile, missing some of the key issues that need science to address them, and often not well linked to the necessary transformation agenda. In the end, funders will be key determinants of whether the knowledge disciplines, the natural, social, data, and normative scientists can truly assist societies on the pathway to sustainability. I'm not naive. I understand the anchors funders have, the interests that provide their funds, the political drivers, and so forth. But as the 2030 approaches, something has to change if we're to make real progress. The competitive model may be important for quality, but over-competitive models lead to fragmentation and little progress, closed doors and closed sciences, conservative rather than innovative developments, and limit access. You have the global power for science to make a difference. The question is, how will we use it? Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for that very, very inspiring and I would say provocative setting of the context for this discussion. You know, the challenge to the funders that you pose and the possibility now of resetting science funding policies is exactly what we wanted. So thank you for that. And I would like to now hand over to our list of speakers. And Dominic, you are first in line. So if I can hand over to you, and Peter and I will switch off our cameras. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Haida. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I wanted to really thank Peter for setting up what I think will be a really exciting conversation that we'll be pursuing this morning. I would like to start just by saying a couple of words about the International Development Research Centre, which is a Crown Corporation of Canada. It's part of Canada's International Development Assistance efforts. And our mandate, which has been our mandate for 50 years, is to support research that leads to innovations and solutions to help developing countries meet and overcome the challenges of development. And of course, those priorities have changed over the last 50 years, but fundamentally at the root of it, it is to build that capacity, collaborate with researchers in lower and middle income countries to respond to the needs in those countries. And so that's the context from which IDRC approached the response to the pandemic. And certainly we, like others, were very motivated to do something in the initial days of this. And my messages here today are going to be about agility and pre-existing mechanisms, or having thought about pre-existing mechanisms to move quickly in these kinds of contexts, to collaborate and to work with others so as not to lead to great redundancies and duplication, but rather synergies and coordination, to respond to needs rather than pushing forward a particular idea of what those needs might be. And certainly in the context of this global emergency, we had the experience of past years, in particular the Ebola experience of 2015, to now have in place a global research and development roadmap in the place of the blueprint of coordinated by WHO. And lastly, the very important point, which is not to forget about everything else. And because the vulnerabilities that we are currently experiencing globally in high-income countries as well, and even more so in low-income countries, the vulnerability we have to the pandemic, the health vulnerabilities, the inequalities that are resulting in some people having more impacts than others, the social and economic vulnerabilities are the result of drivers that are longstanding and that the UN's Agenda 2030 is there to address in the form of the SDGs. So I think not losing track of those key challenges and problems are part of what I'll speak to here. So first on being agile and moving fast. Certainly early in February, IDRC was in communication with the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, which is Canada's health research funding body. And we quickly were able to mobilize a small amount of funding at the time, under $10 million, to activate essentially the Canadian research community, not only to think about immediate medical countermeasures research, many Canadians were already engaged in that, but our particular interest as IDRC was to incentivize collaboration between Canadians and researchers in lower and middle income countries in particular. And we were very happy to see that our initial rapid response galvanized the Canadian government and joined into that response so that it was in fact a $50 million fund that was launched. We were very happy to see quite a lot of collaboration with international partners funded out of that, far beyond our very modest contribution of about $1.5 million. So that effort, I think, is an example of this agility and the importance to be having thought to think about how one would respond quickly and to have in place the mechanisms to mobilize funding quickly, and a peer review committee or a peer review community who's ready to review quickly. And so this was key. A second aspect of our response was to contact our existing research partners with research already underway and ask them, what is the impact of the growing situation? And this was down into March as we realized that the lockdowns were going to be deep and severe. Although at that time we didn't know how long, we began to communicate with our existing grantees to understand better what the impacts were, what the needs might be in terms of how they could adapt their existing research to respond, and at least to be able to manage the situation. So that as a partner, as a funding partner, we view it as crucial that the research funders are able to support researchers in these kinds of crises, but also to have that flexibility to allow a research project perhaps to pivot to fill a key knowledge gap that they are well positioned to do. Thirdly, we did very much assess gaps in the funding landscape. So Canada, like many, many other research funders, was mobilizing a tremendous amount of resources for medical countermeasures, vaccines, diagnostics, treatment, and other immediate pandemic control and pandemic response mechanisms. Very important research. That research is still underway and is rightly a key focus of the global research community. But we identified two major gaps, and one was, in fact, that most of this response, most of this funding was being mobilized in the global north, in higher income countries. And we, as given our mandate, found it was a key moment for us to mobilize capacities in lower and middle income countries. And we were delighted to do that on several fronts, and in particular in collaboration with South Africa's National Research Foundation, and Dr. Kabela, who will be speaking shortly, may speak to that more. But for us, the partnership that we have with organizations like South Africa's NRF and the network of Southern granting councils around the continent that are already being supported through a collaboration of NRF and IDRC, we were able to mobilize them quickly as well to put funds in their hands to be able to fund national research in response to this. And South Africa's leadership, together with support from IDRC, was able to galvanize funding from the UK, from both Department for International Development and UK Research and Innovation, as well as Sweden and even the government of Quebec, a province of Canada. So very exciting opportunity to leverage the capacities that have been growing on the continent over the past decade, and to capitalize on the leadership of South Africa in this case in moving that forward. So building on capacities in lower and middle income countries, as well as identifying and responding to gaps. One of the key gaps that we identified that is particularly a gap in Africa, but not only in Africa, was the mobilization of new technologies, artificial intelligence, to support decision-making in response to the pandemic. And we were very delighted to partner with Sweden through the Swedish International Development Agency to be able to put in place a fund of $10 million to fund research led in developing regions to mobilize AI to respond to this. The call is still open, closes in 2 days. Please see our website, idrc.ca, to find out more. Delighted to be able to put a little plug in for that. The next major gap that we found was around the inordinate, or I wouldn't say inordinate, but major emphasis on medical countermeasures and less emphasis on policy research. And we found, and IDRC has mobilized a significant amount, about a quarter of our budget this year, to support responses and support to decision making. And that's to mobilize research centers and think tanks who are well placed to give that policy advice, to do rapid research in support of decision making on the health front, on the social and economic front as well. Because as we are seeing in Canada and in many other countries, and certainly in lower and middle income countries, the social and economic impacts are severe. Where we go from here, I think, will be very key, because as Peter has said, the coronavirus is responding to or is hitting us in a context where there are other challenges, and certainly our vulnerability to it is as a result of many other challenges. Building back stronger will mean that research councils and research organizations will necessarily need to collaborate more. The nature of research and the way people do research will be severely challenged, I think, by lack of ability to travel, challenges in making sure that participants in research are kept safe, and of course researchers as well, and in building that systemic research and the way forward. And we're committed with our strategy, which is we hope to launch in later this calendar year at IDRC, a 10-year horizon that will be responding to the fact that coronavirus and the pandemic have changed everything, and at the same time changed nothing, in that the drivers of that vulnerability to this pandemic, particularly in lower and middle income countries, arise from these wicked problems of inequality, of growing impacts of climate change, and the difficulty in getting science and innovation into use at scale to bring those solutions to meet the needs of people. And that's where we're going to have our focus going forward. Thank you very much.
Dominique, thank you very much. I'm very tempted to ask you a whole set of questions, but that would be unfair to the audience and to our other speakers. Let me just say that it's very inspiring to hear examples of what can be done and what can be done quickly between and in collaboration with different funders. In the last 15 years of working and talking with funders about collaborative actions, it's often we get stuck in the financial, the legal, administrative obstacles. And so that's, the examples you've raised, and we'll hear more from other colleagues, I'm sure, are really inspiring and do give one a sense of what we can do around urgent needs and challenges that we confront. So thank you very much, Dominique. Molapo, let me turn over to you. If you will switch on your camera and unmute yourself. There you go.
Unmute myself. Hi there, colleagues. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are across the globe. Let me start by really commending the International Science Council for this initiative. Particularly Heide, to you as our executive director, and to Sir Peter as the president of the ISC. This is a sort of initiative that we had hoped the ISC would be playing as the voice of global science, and I think it is testimony to the impact that we are going to have in years to come. Colleagues, I think it would not be an understatement if I said that COVID-19 has had a major impact on our societies across the globe. Obviously here on our continent, on Africa, our economies have really been devastated. Some are going to probably take decades to recover, others maybe a little quicker. Our health and knowledge institutions have been severely impacted. However, if there is a positive aspect, this pandemic has reignited and highlighted, ironically, the important role that science plays in society. Across the globe, science funders like ourselves as the National Research Foundation, science performing institutions, scientists in both the public and private spheres have had to think differently about improving collaboration, coordinating efforts, and enhancing existing or establishing new cooperative agreements. This is a necessary precondition for us if we are to find a lasting, sustainable solution to the problem at hand. Otherwise, we will forever be chasing the feather in the wind. Public funding agencies like the National Research Foundations are indeed at a crossroads of redefining how we fund, and I think Sir Peter raised this particularly sharply, how we conduct and communicate science to the broader society, and how we obviously engaged in debates on science-related matters of public interest, especially in the need to aid policy for science. A large pool of what we continue to grapple with as a science system is not just to ensure that we do quality science and excellent science, but how that science fundamentally has positive impact on our societies. The National Research Foundation, as one of the participating organizations of the Global Research Councils, stands in solidarity with all efforts that promote open science. And we encourage the openness in sharing research findings and the data which will help us, at least in particular case of COVID-19, that diagnostics, vaccines, preventative measures are developed rapidly, not merely for the benefit of individual countries, but for the benefit of all humanity. I was asked, colleagues, to respond to 3 questions. And the first of this is, how has COVID-19 pandemic affected NRF priorities and practices? And I would like to just maybe highlight 2 points. The first is we do everything that we do because we have people that we have to look after, both those that we serve and those that actually work within the organization. And so very rapidly, as a small research funding organization, we have had to adapt all our business units and adjust to our normal practices of coming to the office, of working virtually while remaining and maintaining essential services, such as maintaining critical research infrastructure. This I'm raising particularly in the developing context, where there is a relatively low broadband penetration across our respective countries. We've had to set up comprehensive online employee assistance programs. And again, that assumes that you've had devices, you have had connectivity, and we're providing information and necessary tools to cope with life and work during the post-down. It is not just physical health, but sometimes you find that you've got mental health issues that you need to take into account. In addition to multifunctional responses teams that we have set up to regularly assess the rapidly evolving COVID-19 response levels, all of us probably have 5 levels, and each one has government directives. We've had to consider all of these in making recommendations of the necessary interventions in order to support the organization's responsibility to provide a safe working environment. On the program side, we have obviously had to continue and review and reflect on how we continue to support our science system. But an issue that Dominic has raised, which I appreciate, is that we have partnered with sister agencies across the world, on the continent and beyond, to give practical expression of cooperation, collaboration, and coordination of efforts. We set up a COVID-19 Rapid Grant Fund, and the purpose of this fund is to contribute to Africa's response to COVID-19. It supports 3 strands: research across all knowledge domains, science engagement, and a call to science and health journalists and communicators, as well as science engagement with a call to science advisors. The fund is supported by IDRC of Canada, and a big thank you, Dominic, and please pass our best wishes to John Lebel for the support. Sweden's SIDA, the South African Department of Science and Innovations, Fond de Research to Quebec, the UK's International Development Agency, DFID, and UKRI through the Newton Fund, and obviously 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. What is of interest is that when we closed the call, we had 526 applications. Of interest, we had 66 of those applications under science engagement, specifically calls to science and health journalists and communicators. And secondly, 27 for science advisors. And I think is testimony to how people are appreciating the power of science and that intersection between science and society. The National Research Foundation has also led a number of engagements here at home in South Africa with an intent of making scientific information accessible to all South Africans. We've been working, for instance, with South African Science Journalists Association in supporting the journalist interns to cover the COVID pandemic in all the indigenous languages of the country. And it's important that we use indigenous languages so that we do carry the message to those that really do need to hear it appropriately. In terms of the second question, what are the critical knowledge gaps that will still require attention and funding, and how do we see the value of collaboration? Probably the most important issues that I want to raise is about building trust. As we continue to recover from the worst effects of this pandemic, a key component will be for scientists to further strengthen the public trust that we build in the ability of science to respond to this pandemic. This is a fundamental component to the discourse of science as a public good and not as a self-serving entity. The second issue that I want to raise is about open science and the need for us to accelerate open scientific research is even more urgent as the rapid access to information, data, and infrastructure is critical to addressing current and future global challenges. Open science is a key enabler for science, opening up the data and opening up the data accumulated by scientists to peer review and to the public, allowing for unrestricted collaborative learning, problem solving, and open innovation. On our continent, we are pleased that the National Research Foundation is part of the African Open Science Platform, which seeks to position scientific knowledge, data, and infrastructure as fundamental public resources designed to facilitate innovation both within and outside the science system. The last part that I want to raise under that question is about building long-term partnerships. Many of the partnerships that have enabled us to respond in the manner that we have are historical, but we do need to continue to build on those partnerships, strengthen them, and develop new ones into the future. Colleagues, as I conclude, as public funding agencies, we have the opportunity to advocate for a post-COVID-19 scenario, and a scenario that results in coherent, aligned research and innovation systems where we deliberately and actively collaborate coordinate our efforts, and ensure that what we do does fundamentally respond to the needs of society more holistically. The pandemic has provided us an opportunity, however unfortunate, to trigger our own governments and the world to appreciate the necessity of increasing R&D expenditure in response to not just those issues that we can see coming in the horizon, such as climate change, but those unforeseen challenges that are lurking in the future. And it is through science that we will be able to find solutions to the current and possibly the future challenges that will be confronting us. I thank you.
Well, Alpa, thank you very much for a very rich and thoughtful set of comments in response to the questions that were posed to you. I think it is also really good that you remind us of the reality of the challenges for organizations. I think all of us have experienced that during this crisis, actually our workloads have increased, and it is necessary for us to look at the organizational stresses that have come with COVID. And so under those circumstances, really impressive also what the NRF is doing and continues to do. I like very much your emphasis on in relation to the call on emphasizing also the engagement aspect and the communications, science communications. I think these issues become more critical than ever, and of course are part and parcel of our understanding of open science, which we know Kostas will talk to us more about. So before we get to Kostas, Nakita, I'd like to hand the floor to you, and Molapo and I will switch off cameras.
Hello, thank you very much. Do you hear me? So thank you very much for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to discuss with you. So I will present you. I have some slides, which is a little bit quite different. So I'm just going to the next one to say that what is ANR? ANR, in a nutshell, we are the French National Funding Agency. We are funding we are funding science in all areas, both basic research and applied research, both research which is completely bottom-up, in bottom-up calls, and as well priority-driven programs. And of course, we are funding all research organization, universities, as well as private sector. And so now next, of course, as a funding agency, which is as well doing some top-down, next slide, please, because it doesn't go fast enough for me to, yeah. As a funding agency, what we have done with the crisis, we have used one of our instrument, which is called, can I have the next slide, please? Up. No, it was the previous one, sorry. So on, on COVID actions, we used our flash call, which is an instrument which is done in reaction with an unforeseen event where we need to mobilize very rapidly researcher and research force. We use this, and so we use this instrument. And in early March, so we set up this call during February, and call was launched early March. And what important thing it is that all the different instruments, all the different actions were worked with some expert groups. In France, we had two expert groups. One is CARE on COVID-19 Research Expertise Analysis Committee, and another one which is called REACTING, Multidisciplinary Group on Research and Action Targeting emerging infectious diseases. So we worked with those and of course different stakeholders in order to have something which is integrated and coordinated inside France. We launched this call very rapidly, so it was by end of March. We focused it on the 4 World Health Organization priorities, which were interdisciplinary, life science, engineering, digital, and social science and humanities. And what we have done, we have reinvented everything. This means that 4 days after the closure of this first call, we began pre-funding some 44 projects to make them start in April. What we have done, we have begun alone. This means it was only with the funding of ANR. We had 3 million euro funding from ANR, and then we looked for teaming up with others and finding some co-funding with others. And so by the end, we ended up with 19 million euros from different French regions, ministries, and charities. And in May, we had funded 110 projects. Of course, then we had the evaluation, and these 44 were re-evaluated, of course. So that was to say that we wanted things to go very rapid, and so we had to reinvent all the way we were even doing our evaluation, but as well funding. And of course, what you will see for the reporting is the same. Then after this first call, which was a first push, what we wanted it is to have a second call, which is still open. It is open from April to October, and which is a research action type of call where researchers are proposing some research for 3-4 months or 6 months, and then it is followed by action. So it is this type of structure. And up to now, we have, this morning I learned that we have up to now funded 25 research action projects. There's no deadline. It will go until October. So now concerning international cooperation, we have done exactly like for the co-funding. Now for the next slide, for the international cooperation, we had to go fast. So as we were on short-term fast, we first launched our call and then tried to see with our big partners, agencies, how we could discuss and coordinate our work. And we prefer this action rather than negotiating a big transnational multilateral call that would take time. That can be done in a second step. And we, for instance, co-funded with the BMBF German a big project, which is actually, we had a call on civil security, on biological threats, and we could fund some one project and one big project in with COVID. With Japan, the GST, what we have done, we have teamed up their J-Rapid call and the ANR Flash call, and we co-funded 3 projects. And with China, the NSFC, what we are discussing today, it is handling a workshop bringing together the projects from both countries. And of course, we have shared all these responses with some common platforms, with other funding agencies through the Global Research Council, through Science Europe, and through Glopidar. Then next, what were the issues about, sorry, next slide. Yeah, the challenges, of course, one thing what was said by my colleague from IDRC, it is the flexibility, the rapidity, and coordination. We had reinvented a lot of things here to adapt it to this situation. I already explained some of it. For the reporting as well and the monitoring, what we want it is to get connection with the stakeholders in order to be sure that the results will be used very rapidly and the solution proposed. And of course, the calls, for instance, the open call is evolving in terms of content, the funding, and so on. And of course, all things is as well looked with coordination with what's happening inside Europe with the ERA COVID working group. For our everyday business, the ongoing calls, of course, were delayed. The deadlines delayed. We have to handle the virtual remote scientific evaluation panels of 35 persons together by remote. That is one issue. And for the ongoing projects, we have set up a systematic extension of projects. Extra budget for extension of PhDs and postdocs is foreseen on a case-by-case basis today. And so now what's next? What's next? Next slide, please. Yeah. In our priorities for 2021 call, what we can see it is that now we are pushing more on understanding the anthropic and environmental health and economic factor that may play a role. What we want as well, it is to see how we can, what is important, it is how we can, research can help to face such global crisis and global pandemics. So more generally, as well, one important thing it is to how we can find some solution, proposed solution for economic recovery, for facing these global challenges and increasing the resilience of the society. So these are some forthcoming topics and gaps to be treated. And I have to say that most of them are quite interdisciplinary. And how can we set this, and how do we see this at the international scene? It is that at a first step, as that is, next slide, please, as this will be implemented anyway in our 2021 call, it is that all these priorities are open to the collaboration that we have either through lead agency or not with our major colleagues from Europe, other European countries, lead agency, or even outside of Europe with Taiwan, with Singapore, with Brazil, and to open up and have this in a bottom-up scheme like this, to have this possibility of working together. Then in big part of European partnerships, people are already working on, I have put the names here down, on how they can work together either for their future calls or their future strategy to take into account this COVID-19. And then, especially in the area of social science and humanities, we have the Bonn group, which is grouping Germany, UK, France, and Netherlands, which is on social science, and they are looking at having a common platform for projects in social sciences and having common understanding there. So that is sort of things which are on the way, and we will certainly be open for more collaboration. And now, next slide, please. If I can have my next slide. Yeah, that's my last one. Then the COVID-19, we think it is a real textbook case for open science. We have, many of us funders have signed, and INR has done this, a common international declaration on sharing research and data and finding the relevant to the new COVID outbreak. So, we have tried to put in place really all the open science items, and we see how it is important on COVID-19. So it will be really interesting to see how it goes on. And then a second thing, it is as well, it's just a case study, not a textbook one, this one, for the relation between science and society. Because we have seen, I don't know, at least in France, we can see that it is really poses how with the big expectation and the big pressure that the media put on the scientific and the expectation of the society. How should we communicate with the public? How should we communicate? We had some specific scientific group. How should they communicate with decision makers, with politicians? And how should we handle scientific controversy, which is put on the public place? And these are some topics that is, I think, in our hands today to work really for next step. Thank you very much.
Nikita, thank you very much. And you are my witness. We didn't orchestrate it like this, but you've opened up beautifully to the next speaker, Kostas, who is going to be talking on open science. But thank you for inspiring examples of what can be done quickly, for re-emphasizing the important issues of engagement with stakeholders, science communications, trust in science, open science. And it does make me think one of the conversations we might have following on from a webinar like this is to perhaps undertake a broader comparative analysis of this kind of response from some of the funders, perhaps something we can think about doing together also with the Global Research Council. But Kostas, I am now going to hand over to you. So unmute yourself and we will.
Okay. You can hear me, I guess.
Yes, we can, Kostas. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Heide. Thank you all for organizing this webinar. That it is very timely. I will focus my intervention on the open science role in the pandemic. And I'm sorry I don't have the picture, an image, and so I'll be calling the numbers of the slides so that we make sure we are on the right slide. So slide 2, please. So the European Union had a multifaceted response to the coronavirus crisis that addressed the health and emergency measures, the economic response from loans to small companies towards making liquidities available for member states, the coordinated exit from the crisis, the recovery plan that it was proposed a couple of weeks ago, and as you know now, it is a very hot issue of discussion for the 750 billion euros recovery plan. And among the different measures taken was also research and funding. In research, we launched already in February a dozen projects specifically on the coronavirus and COVID-19. This was followed up by another 130 million, so have invested 200 million euros so far in new projects. We have also reorientated part of the work of previous projects and infrastructures to address the crisis. Next slide, please. Slide 3. So we have already intervened as a funder. But one very important issue that was we realized early on in the beginning of March is that actually research without data and without access to data, especially in a very complex real situation like the pandemic, is very difficult to be productive. So very quickly we started the work to be able to launch a data sharing platform, open data sharing platform in the context of open science for COVID-19. We approached the European Molecular Biology Laboratory and various partners, including Elixir, which is an EU infrastructure for genomics data, trying to bring together a platform where all types of data can be accessed and combined, like omics data, genomics, proteomics, but epidemiological data as well, clinical research data, as well as clinical patient data, even data from the social sciences and humanities. Very quickly, it came up. It is operational since 20th of April. As of a couple of 10 days ago, it already had 2 million requests for data. I'm not going to go through the numbers. So it's already working. However, it became very quickly apparent the great difficulty to combine data from multiple disciplines, to be able to combine, for example, sequences of the virus with the sequence or the patient data of the host of the virus. Tremendously complex. This is an issue, of course, that has been around for many years, 10 years, 20 years. We are trying to do in weeks or months progress that should have been done for many years before. It is a very difficult issue, but we are making steps ahead. Several speakers talked about artificial intelligence or about research and so on. I want to emphasize that without data sharing, there is nothing. There is a very thin layer to base this research on. You need most of the studies, most of the projects do not have a critical mass. They don't produce. They cannot produce themselves data that are of sufficient size and of sufficient breadth, so that the conclusions of that are generalizable. And I'll come to this issue later on and tell you why open science is the solution. So this is one thing that we did. The European COVID-19 Research Data Platform. We have communicated information to the WHO about it, to the ECDC, to our international partners, to many organizations, and we hope that everybody will be depositing and download data from the platform. We did a number of other things. In terms of open science, all these grants that I talked about, the 200 million more or less, new money for COVID-19, they have special grant conditions. So we do have an open science policy, an open access policy overall, but to these grants we put more stringent conditions. They have to make their data open within a month of collecting them, and they have to make them interoperable, reusable, so in short, fair. And they do have to have data management plans. So they do have, really, it's a contractual condition that they need to share data. We produced also detailed guidelines to all projects, not just the COVID-19, but also those indirectly related, on how the beneficiaries, how the researchers could go beyond their contractual obligations in order really to enable the open sharing of findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data. And we have communicated these guidelines also to all our EU member states, as well as the Wellcome Trust, the CDC, and so on. The open air infrastructure also, that's something different. They have launched a new gateway to aggregate and enable discovery of relevant publication and data sets. And we have been working also with the Research Data Alliance. Some of you are familiar with it, who set up very quickly, already in mid of March, a working group, and has already delivered a semi-final recommendation, semi-final guidelines on data sharing for health emergency prompted specifically by the COVID-19. So these are some of the things we did. At the same time, we have participated in several global initiatives. The Commission has undersigned the declaration on sharing, a statement rather, on sharing research data and findings relevant to the outbreak put forward, initiated by the Wellcome Trust. We have organized the matchathons, as they are called now, and hackathons, on bringing more and more citizens into the game, but also small companies and so on, to help connect research with entrepreneurship for addressing the crisis. We, along with several other countries, I think 14 in total, we adhere to this letter, open letter, initiated by the Office of Science and Technology of the President, OSTP, calling on publishers to open up their publications, their journals, during the coronavirus crisis, and this had quite some effect. And we also organized, this is a more major thing probably, this pledging conference, to which I think all of you, all of your countries have participated, where we raised a significant amount of money. It was 7.4 billion on the 4th of May, but tomorrow, in fact, the 27th of June, is the final pledging summit. So where we join forces with the Global Citizens Initiative, and I think that we'll go above 10 billion euros total pledged in favor of for research and development for COVID-19. It's not the Commission that organizes it alone, of course. As you probably know, it's to us with a number of countries, as well as with the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation. Okay, so that was a summary of what we have been doing. But how about what will this pandemic change, and in terms of open science? Because so many things is going to change, but I'm again focusing on open science. So first of all, and I'm going very quickly because I have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes left. First of all, the science-society relation. This was brought up by several people. The scientists have become the stars today. In a way, this also implies a lot of responsibility. We have every few years a Eurobarometer on science, society, trust, and relations. Last one was 2013. It was good, but it had also some very worrying trends as part of it regarding the trust that the average citizen shows to science. Let's see how we'll have the next one, the end of this year. It will be very interesting to see how the indices have evolved. But beyond science-society relations, what's going to change? So first, I think it will become far more evident that it's all good to talk about openness and everything else along these lines, but for as long as you don't have access to the data, if the data are not reusable, and if you cannot combine them and use them, then it becomes a philology. It's extremely important that we make progress, and we have started with COVID-19 along that direction, but also through many other initiatives. It is imperative that we make progress in making data fair and available globally. Secondly, next slide, please. Oh, I was forgetting to call the slides, I think. We're slide 7 now. second issue, it is, and this was mentioned by Peter at the beginning, it is the issue of reproducibility. If you look at Nature has published a series of papers, and now this slide is from older publications, but an amazing up to 85% of health research may be wasted. Maybe wasted because the results are never used by anybody else, and they are, and very often they are completely wrong. They are wrong where they could have been correct. And part of the reason has to do with methodology. Another large part of the reason has to do with openness of the methodology, openness of the data. They don't know data that are there already, or they know that they exist, but they cannot reuse them, or the scientists that did the first research, they didn't publish the data because they're not successful. So the same things are repeated over and over and over again because nobody has access to the data. So this is mind-boggling, really. This number, 300 billion per year, 85 of which, up to 85% of which may be wasted. So the recent scandal, I would say, with the hydroxychloroquine and the article in the Lancet and the retraction, and same with the New England Journal of Medicine, where in very prestigious journals, articles were published with unsure provenance of the data, without anybody checking on the quality of the data, and of course, at the end coming to the wrong conclusions, I think will change the mood in this whole area of reproducibility. And finally, and next slide, 8. This is also something that Peter mentioned at the beginning, where he started. He talked about the neoliberalism of science and about the tyranny of bibliometrics and of competition in science. I think the coronavirus crisis will I hesitate to say will change this. It's not going to change this, but we'll put this in a different light. And we intend in the next year, in the next 12 months, to take at the EU level several initiatives along this direction, along the directions that you can see hopefully on the slide, in terms of going from a system that rewards individuality and competition and quantity of publications towards a system that defines excellence in a different way and that rewards also collaboration and rewards sharing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Kostas, thank you so much, and also for sticking to the time despite not being able to see me, but you were perfect. Very interesting examples. Once again, I think we are seeing across the last 5 presentations some key trends, and of course it raises for an organization like the IDRC as a global voice for science the need to really connect and defragment the initiatives towards advocating for the imperative of open science in a post-COVID world. I want to invite all our speakers and our keynote to please switch on their cameras and to join me now in a question and answer session. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you very much. Dominique, are you still with us? Peter, I wonder whether, so we are, let me say, colleagues, there are a lot of questions that we're collecting, and as I said, we will not be able to address all of them, but we're also getting comments of thanks to the speakers for very, very interesting interventions. And so I think we do need to take stock after this meeting about whether we organize a follow-up conversation. But Peter, I wonder whether, you know, you set a challenge, a very provocative challenge for the funders in terms of resetting funding policy. And from what you've heard, I wanted to give you a minute to just share some reflections on what you are hearing from these examples of collaboration, of engagement, and of priorities towards, you know, addressing some of the issues you raised as challenges.
Well, I think what we can see is some green shoots in all these examples. Every one of those examples showed shoots and elements of what I was talking about. I think all the speakers would agree that there's much further to go, that we're starting on a journey, that there's a fundamental change in the way science systems have to operate if we're to meet the needs of the 7 billion people on the planet and of the planet itself. And I still worry a lot that even in COVID, much of the focus of the flash calls has been on the biomedical side of it. I've not seen the flash calls really looking at the issues of the social response, the policy response, how evidence was used by governments, etc., etc. You know, this is the biggest single experiment in the world on how evidence impacts on public policy and how public policy uses evidence. And yet we've struggled even to get a few dollars through INSA to actually look at what's happening around the world. This is an enormously important opportunity, which is a forerunner of how we will deal with future existential threats. And I think it's that kind of broader research opportunity that worries me, that we're not yet have mechanisms that will do that in a hurry. You know, so congratulations to all these efforts which are green shoots, but let's put some fertilizer on them, let's put some water on them, let's see them grow faster. It has to.
Thank you, Peter. And colleagues, I think this, you know, take this as a first question. I'm going to read out a couple of other questions that have come in, and then just go around the table, so to speak, and give you all a chance to respond. But I think Peter does raise a very important question about, you know, the emphasis has fallen on the biomedical, and for me that raises the question in terms of the Global Forum of Funders as well. How do we reorient back towards the SDGs? How do we respond to the UN Secretary General's call to build back better by recommitting to the 2030 agenda? So that's one question. Clearly, there are a series of questions about, given concerns about the economic implications of this crisis and the financial constraints that national governments invariably will face, what do we anticipate as the impacts on national funding systems, and how do we best advocate with governments for increased investments in science? What sort of trends are you imagining and foreseeing in that regard? And related to that, perhaps a question that you would also want to speak to, Peter, what is the role of science diplomacy in that advocacy, in making the case to governments now that, given what we've seen with COVID, that there, you know, that the support for science is fundamental? On a completely different track, there is a question to the funders around, are we, given rapid response mechanisms and also the review processes that go with that, are we seeing an increase, or is there a danger of an increase in producing pseudoscience? Here's an interesting one for you. And another question around, are we also seeing more effective and increased collaboration with science in the private sector? So what are the trends we're seeing in terms of the science public-private sector engagement around this? Let me leave it there and go around the table and invite you to address those issues you find most interesting, including the response to Peter's challenge. So, Dominique, may I start with you?
Thank you. Thank you, Haida. Sorry, a little bit of a lag there. Friday, we say in Canada, the internet is tired at the end of the week. Thanks very much for the questions, and your challenge to us, Peter, is very well taken, I think. Certainly for us at IDRC, we're very fortunate that our mandate, which is one to support research for development, positioned us quite well to respond to the gap that you had identified. And we did do that, I mentioned briefly, by essentially doing a very rapid landscape exercise to understand what the needs were, and to mobilize 70 or so of the leading think tank organizations and research centers of excellence across the Global South to provide proposals on how they would provide that rapid research on the economic impacts, on the social impacts of so social cohesion, the need for social protection, these kinds of policy gaps, and how they would do that in a way that was real time. The policies around food price, food systems, and value chains and food supply in order to ward off potential food crisis in the context of the aftermath of the pandemic and the lockdown. So those kinds of questions we felt would be a gap. We had the same observation as you did. Very interesting, though, in an attempt to mobilize additional funders around this question, much more challenging than it had been to mobilize funders around medical countermeasures or to mobilize funders around a specific science, comfortable science entry point like artificial intelligence. The social and economic policy piece felt a little bit less comfortable, with the exception, I would say, of NRF and the African granting councils, who included quite a wide definition of pandemic response research in the rapid call. So there is a trend, I would say, but we found that we were a bit alone out there. We were fortunate because of the timing of the pandemic at our new fiscal year beginning, we were able to retool our budget and mobilize quite a lot of funding. I just want to say one thing quickly on what happens next and the real risks that we are facing. I think none of us are going to be surprised if there is pressure on science funding budgets, on funding to science agencies, on funding to aid budgets as well. And that's IDRC is at the intersection of those two spaces. We fully expect that. We have to pay the piper. Governments have mobilized huge funding to deal with this situation. And this is where I think your call for international collaboration, Peter, is right. And we do need to be very careful of the excess redundancy of science that has gone in response to the immediate crisis. And certainly going forward in a constrained environment of reduced financial resources for science, the opportunity to work together, to coordinate, to collaborate, and to align research agendas with the SDGs, what the gaps look like in the aftermath of COVID. We are at significant risk of some of those lagging SDGs to lag further, and much of the progress that may have been made on some of them to take a step back, particularly in lower income countries. And so how do we then think about innovation in a new way? That innovation that will be able to actually catch up that gap and leap forward. Business as usual won't work. And I think that's where COVID changes everything and nothing at the same time. We knew innovation will be needed, and innovation that was different perhaps than the innovations we were thinking of before, to solve the problems in health systems, to address inequalities and improve employment, to address education systems. 1.5 at one point billion children were out of school, and certainly most of them had not gone back yet. What does that mean in terms of the setbacks to society, to the futures for those children, and where can innovation make a difference in helping countries meet the needs of society, be it education, health, environment, employment, and economy in this everything and nothing has changed context after coronavirus. So I look forward to continuing our great collaborations. And one final thing, which I had mentioned before, and I will state again, because for us it is crucial, and it's become integral to IDRC's new policy, new strategy going forward. It is crucial for science funders to invest more attention and perhaps even more resources in that translation of knowledge, in that policy advice. Bodies like INGSA are important. How can we make sure that the funding gets into the innovations that result from that get into use, the knowledge that is developed gets into use to move us forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominique. And let me also thank IDRC for the role you play in helping us on the steering committee of the Global Forum of Funders. So we look forward to continuing this conversation. Molapo, I'm going to turn to Nikita next, but I wanted to give you a heads up that there is a specific question to you on the financing side, and that is how African governments can work together to mobilize increased resourcing, particularly to address priorities related to some of the environmental and sustainability challenges. So you might want to ponder that. And Nikita, if I could turn to you for responses, maybe for a minute or two. Thank you. You are still muted, I think.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, and I really appreciate all the provocative insights from Peter. You are fully right, and we are not looking for only calls or flash calls on with epidemiologists. And unfortunately, I said it is an interdisciplinary one. It is quite open in all areas, but I didn't have time to talk about the outcome of it. The first flash call inside, we had 30% of projects actually which were around social science and humanities, which were looking at problems of public health, problem of ethics, problem of policy and economic. And in the research action program, actually 2 of the topics are on really focused on what are the global challenges, so at global scale and in all areas, and as well with what are the social and economic dynamics which are coming from it. And so that is 2 out of 5 topics which are really around that. And so you are completely right, we should have this, and that is what we are looking for. And we got some part of it, but that should be increased. So yes, for sure. Now, on the different way of doing research, I think as well, we had the example of co-funding. When we see in co-funding, it is not just only money. Of course, it brought some money, some budget, but as well, it is different type of stakeholders. And our experience in these type of flash calls or in the calls where we have some co-funders, which are coming in with a very targeted issue. Of course, we are talking about research, but they have other networks and they have other views. And so we are constructing together and we are working together on this. And this co-funding not only brings some funding, but as well, it brings another way of understanding what research is doing and how a researcher can spread and take over the result of their research. I think there is something to do there, which is not just only with the budget, but it is co-working and co-setting agendas together. And that is quite important. So that is what I wanted to say about this. Then you talked, I don't know who talked about the public-private partnership. Here, that is really, I think there's a fear, and that not only fear, that we begin to see the effect of it. It is that with the financial crisis, the result it is that the private sector is decreasing its investment in research. And the forecast that we have here in France from my colleagues, and it is that we are expecting a decrease of 20 to 30% of these of this investment in research from the private sector. So that will make a big change, and in the way we will be able to work and the budget that we will have. So that's a real issue.
Thank you very much, Nikita. Molapo, I'm going to hand over to you.
Haida, thank you. Before I come to the issue that is a little difficult for me to answer, how do African governments, and I think it's probably across all the globe, it's not just in Africa that we have this problem. I want to talk to the little issue of pseudoscience. Let's accept that we will have it from time to time. It'll always be there. There are people who will always like to take corners and cut corners and come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful results that are not. But obviously, as funders, as research funders, what we must never compromise on is research integrity. The integrity of the research enterprise, the knowledge enterprise must have integrity. So when we fund the research, whether it's for rapid results or for that matter for long-term endeavors, we must insist on the integrity of the research. Everything from ethical clearances, we must not take corners, particularly when people start to think that we've got a major national or for that matter global problem in our hands and therefore dispense of ethical clearances. We shouldn't compromise on those. Peer review should not be suddenly compromised. So my view is that as long as we hold the line as funding agencies, then we will minimize the degree at which we get pseudoscience in the global science system, but accept that it'll always be there. Coming to the challenging issue of how do we go beyond coordinating to actively collaborating across boundaries, it's hard. It really is very hard. Nation states find it almost impossible to put their monies into one pot and accept the fact that they are, in essence, allowing the collective to decide on the future of the collective and not of the individual nation. And I think that's a real challenge that is global and not just on the continent. Our real challenge on our continent at this juncture is to encourage our nations to invest whatever modest amount you have to support the knowledge enterprise and knowledge institutions in particular. And I'll use an example where we have managed to do this reasonably well. Again, coming to my sister Dominique and the way in which IDRC has been instrumental and creative, we have come together to support 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, support to develop institutions such as the National Research Foundation in these 15 countries. And then we have gone beyond that to say, let us find a way of co-funding research chairs that will be placed in our own knowledge institutions. But nobody gets a research chair because they're a member. You earn it. You have to apply the same rigor, the same expectations of performance as you come in. But secondly, you all have to contribute something. It doesn't matter how modest it is, but you contribute. And that way you have ensured that there is a stake. Everybody feels that they have to make sure that the endeavor succeeds. And so that's our challenge in the first instance, is to find a way of continuously encouraging African member states to contribute their relatively modest incomes, because their economies are not exactly the strongest on the globe. They may be fast growing, but in real terms, it's a very modest investment that they can actually make. Let me pause there, and maybe I can come back to at a later stage around the way in which there is an impact on the national funding systems as a consequence of the downturn of our economies.
Thank you, Lapo. And you've just convinced me that we need another webinar because we've actually run out of time. So I know some of you might have to leave, and if you do, please feel free. But if we could take another 4 minutes so that I can give Costas an opportunity, also Costas, to share your thoughts in response to Peter's challenge, what you've heard from the other colleagues' presentations and some of the questions raised. So 2 minutes to you, Costas, and then I'm going to wrap up with all your permissions. Over to you, Costas.
Okay, thanks very epigrammatically. I don't have much to say. I mean, Peter is right. Sometimes the issue is that the research and policy responsibles for evidence-based policy are not financed by research programs. For example, in the Commission, they are to some extent financed from the JSC's budget, the Joint Research Center budget, and from the health program outside the research programs. So sometimes the communication is not very appropriate. But I agree with him that much more could be done. In terms of applications for research funding, yes, this could be very negative. In our case, in fact, through the last proposal for the recovery fund, 15 billion additional were given to us for the next financial period, not for health research only, but for other priority areas too. So this will not have a negative impact as such. The crisis, on the contrary, this because it has demonstrated the value, the importance of science. It has provided an argument for increasing the budget for science and research. The increase in the pseudoscience, I agree with the previous speakers that, yeah, I wouldn't worry very much. It is a real issue. We have seen the number of preprints that have been shooting up during the crisis. On the other hand, again, if everything is open, including the data underlying the preprints, then it is everybody's task to check and to verify, to validate the conclusions. And I think the benefits of sharing early in such a situation far outweigh the drawbacks of having some low-quality research being put up there in the open. Finally, I just want to let you know that because we talked about, because Molapo talked about Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, that we had the high-level policy group meeting a week ago, and COVID-19, of course, was a major issue, and open science was a main point in the agenda. We have the ministerial meeting in a few days. The European Union, African Union ministers were open science also will be on the agenda. So it is something that becoming in the center of our international cooperation policies. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kostas. I think also worth mentioning is the UNESCO process of developing a recommendation on open science. And there certainly becomes a point of collaboration for us and follow-up conversations, Kostas, also in light of the African Open Science Platform. Colleagues, I also think that for the Global Forum of Funders, which, by the way, Katja, my colleague online, is managing, this has been tremendously valuable. We will get back to you not only about the possibility of further conversations while we're in this situation, but clearly also next steps for the forum and the meeting envisaged for 2021, early 2021. Peter, before I hand over to you, maybe for a closing thought, I also wanted to mention to our funding colleagues online that the ISC is now engaged together with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IDRC, on a project that is looking at pathways to building back better in a number of sectors, and one of the tracks of priority there is around science systems. And the way in which that work is being organized is that we are doing a series of international consultations, and the science systems track, which is chaired by Livia Brito, who heads the Montevideo office of UNESCO, is very keen to have an engagement with the funders. So we will be returning to you and to other colleagues online to engage you in those conversations as well. And today's conversation, I think, will be of huge value to that initiative. Peter, I know that you've been awake for 20 hours and we need to let you go, and we've had, you know, our online attendees who have not been able to speak. This is frustrating for them, so I'm aware of the time, but maybe a final minute to you, Peter, for closing thoughts, key messages to take home.
2 words before a final thought, and that is mental health. I've not heard in any of this discussion anything about mental health, and yet I suspect it will be the biggest long-term impact of this crisis. Lots of people who were already vulnerable have been made more vulnerable. A lot of people who didn't think they were vulnerable before have been made vulnerable. And I think that there is a huge effort needed to think about mental well-being in the context of the reset. I just want to make one last comment, and that is that after every other major crisis of this nature, be it the world wars, the global recession, there are major resets in the way the world operates. I think that what we have here is the potential that we've been talking for a long time of the need for science systems to evolve and change from being what I call an industrialized system to being a system that is integrated and serving the needs of the people and the planet. I would hope, and I think we've heard green shoots tonight, that we're seeing evidence that we can shift this system over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years away from where it was to a system that will actually achieve what we need to achieve if we're going to have healthy lives for this and the next generation. And I think what we've heard from all the speakers today is goodwill to try and move down that path. While we know it will be difficult because there are many different parts to it and constituencies and interests, we have to do it because these existential risks are real risks and they're going to affect us all, and they're the most important thing that the science system can do. People believe that science can make a difference. COVID has shown it can. Now we must use it in a broader sense. So thank you to everybody. I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Peter. And I would add to your word on mental health as a truly transdisciplinary field of study, right? So, colleagues, first of all, thank you to the speakers. We really, really appreciate this exciting conversation. Thank you to my colleagues online for the organizing of the webinar, Zhenya, Anne, and Katsia, who is managing our global forum and whose idea this webinar was. So thank you, Katsia. And to our online attendees, we had, I think, at some point up to 170. They're now down to 102, and that's my fault, because we went over time. So Kostas, despite the fact that we can't see you, we're all waving and clapping, applauding remotely. Thank you and have a good weekend, everybody. And good rest, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
weekend, everybody. Good
It's
to
been
see
a
you.